All right. So thank you, Brendan, and good morning, everyone. I am Christy Rubenstein from Diana T. Myers & Associates, and we're going to go ahead and get started. Thank you for joining us today for the first webinar training of 2019 for the Eastern PA COC and Western PA COCs. We're glad you are able to join us today to learn more about the topic of positive youth and human development. We're being led today by two experienced and skilled trainers from Valley Youth House. For those of you unfamiliar with Valley Youth House, it was founded in 1973 and began as a homeless and runaway shelter in Bethlehem, Pennsylvania. Currently, the organization serves 30,000 youth and families in counties in eastern and central Pennsylvania with a variety of services ranging from prevention to behavioral health, independent living, and therapeutic recreation via their summer camp program. They also recently received funding for a new host homes program in western Pennsylvania, which we're excited about. Our trainers today from Valley Youth House are Elizabeth Allen and Andrew Palomo. Elizabeth has a master's degree and has been a professional in the mental health field for the past 20 years. A defender of what is right for her entire life, Elizabeth has had many roles, including inpatient counselor, in-home family therapist, experiential therapy ropes course facilitator, and mentor to youth and their families. As an instructor, Elizabeth teaches a variety of topics for Valley Youth House and has co-presented at the Pennsylvania Permanency Conference and the National Runaway and Homeless Youth Conference. Andrew has a master's in social work and has been working with runaway and homeless youth for over 15 years. He began his career as direct care staff at Valley Youth House's youth shelter and transitional living program. He oversaw the daily operations of Valley Youth House's maternity group home, where 7 homeless parenting teens reside. And in 2016, Andrew implemented the first LGBT drop-in center in the Lehigh Valley. Currently, Andrew is the Director of Research, Evaluation, and Innovation at Valley Youth House, where he supports data-driven decision-making and results-oriented performance for RHY programs. So with these two very experienced professionals, we are in good hands, and I can't wait to get started. But before we get going, I just want to let everyone know that this webinar is being recorded. Correct, Brendan? We are recording?
That is correct. Yep, I will have it recorded and posted to Workplace and the COC website probably within the week.
Great. And so we encourage you to please share the link with any colleagues in the COCs who were unable to join today but who you feel would be interested or would benefit from hearing today's webinar. Also, I want to quickly go over how we'll be handling Q&A for today's webinar. As with previous ones, we're going to keep everyone muted. So we ask that you use the Q&A box to type in your questions or comments. Please feel free to type in your questions at any time during the webinar. I believe that Elizabeth and Andrew will take breaks during today's webinar to respond to your questions if there are any, and then we'll have some time at the end as well. During the Q&A breaks, Brendan will read your questions to the speakers. So if you by any chance enter your question into the chat box, that's okay too. Brendan's going to keep an eye on both the chat box and the Q&A box, and we'll read your questions to the presenters no matter where you input them. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to Elizabeth and Andrew.
Good morning, everybody. So my name is Elizabeth Allen. I am the Staff Development Supervisor with Valley Youth House. I've been with the agency for approximately 16 years now, and based here in Bethlehem, where we're kind of watching gently the snow coming down, but we're really looking forward to presenting this material to you all today.
Yeah, and I'm Andrew, and as you can see from my picture, I am shorter than Elizabeth Allen. That's also in real life and on the PowerPoint presentation. So, like Christy said, I do research and evaluation here at Valley Youth House, but my roots are in the runaway and homeless youth programs from Valley Youth House. That's where I started and have spent most of my career in.
All right, so we're going to look at our objectives, which is basically the what's in it for me. So, you know, over 100 plus of you signed on to join us today, which we appreciate greatly. And we just kind of want to go over what you're going to get out of this. So the first thing is we want to make sure that we have a definition of what is positive youth and human development. There are a bunch out there. We're going to talk about a few different ones. and make sure that you have a firm grasp as to what this concept is. It's something that some of you may be very familiar with. Others, it might be brand new, so we're hoping that we kind of have something for everybody today. We also want to give you some historical context and look at how programs have operated in the past and how even, honestly, some programs still operate now, and so what makes positive youth development a little bit different. We're going to make sure we give you guys some really good examples of how it works in the field, because theory is great, but we all know that there are those situations where it's like you read something and the theory seems to work wonderfully, and then you try to apply it and it kind of falls flat. So we want to make sure that we give you some really good examples. We're also going to talk about the elephants in the room, because again, when we hear different theories, oftentimes it's the, yeah, but what about? And we want to address some of those and some of the pieces of maybe cynicism that you might get, especially from a supervisory standpoint. As you're presenting this to some of your staff, they might present like very cynical or be like, I don't understand why this is going to work. So we're going to talk about some of that and make sure that we prep you with the information that you need ahead of time. And then we also really want to talk about the link of the staff development, which is that part, again, for supervisors and also for any professionals that are listening in today, of how they can help themselves become more of a positive youth and family practitioner.
So as we get started, right, something that I do just want to just put out there is that we're going to be dealing with a lot of gray areas, right? Like, I think like our youth are difficult, our young people are difficult, even the families that we work with present themselves with challenging situations that we have to help them navigate through. So we are entering this sea of gray where we have to be uncomfortable with anything that's being thrown at us, especially being youth professionals. So it's just something that I start out with, that like there's always going to be those ifs and always going to be those what ifs and those extremes that do occur in our programs. And we're definitely going to be here to help prepare you to deal with a lot of those situations, but also being aware that there are no simple solutions when dealing with our young people and our families, and especially those difficult situations that they present. So that's where we're going to start from, just getting that out of the way, that a lot of these things are going to be very complex when we're dealing with it. So to start, right, where does positive youth and human development really begin, right? It really takes into consideration that ecosystemic framework in social work. For my social workers out there, it's that system theory that we talk about, and how our young people, our young families, we have to take into consideration all the systems and all the interactions that are happening with the young person, with the family, and how these have impacts on our young people and real life impacts, right? So our young person dealing with family issues, is interacting with their school systems, interacting with larger policies that are happening in our country, as well as cultural and norms and what's happening in that bigger system. So PYHD really stems from this work, right? Really stems from this ecosystemic point of view and this systems theory of like we're taking consideration the person, their person in environment, right? Like so like how is the environment interacting with our young person, and really taking into account all of these things that play into the lives of our young people. So we've come a long way from the early, like in the 1970s and 80s of traditional youth services, right? And moving agencies from those traditional youth service agencies to becoming positive youth development agencies, right? So our traditional youth programs really focus on problems and deficits. They are very reactionary and viewed youth as participants, and these are our programs that you're gonna receive because I'm the professional, right? So that was the traditional view of how services have worked, right? But a positive youth development approach is a little bit different, right, or a lot different, actually. So we're focusing on the positive outcomes. So we talk about strengths-based, and I know Elizabeth will go into this a little bit detailed, the difference between being strengths-based and positive youth development. But we're focusing on those positive outcomes for our youth. We're being proactive, instead of being reactive, which, we're planning for this young person or helping them plan together as a team. Instead of having targeted youth, we're focusing on all youth as a community, working with all youth that are out there. And then also youth as active participants, right? I think that's something that we've seen in the last year, especially in our COCs with youth action boards, youth advisory boards. How do we move our young people from being recipients to being those active participants, being active members of decision-making, and being active members in our programs. Then also that community response, that our programs are within communities and looking at how do we incorporate the communities into our programs, because that's really where change comes from, right? We hear a lot about working together collaboratively, collective impact, and that's something that positive youth development does bring to the table. How do we really work as a community and as a team to really impact change, right? So, and this has been a good 30 years of transitioning our youth service programs from this traditional model to this positive youth development model, and that's something that in this training we hope that you observe that the PYD model is a model that does provide positive results, and there is evidence to support that the PYD model does improve outcomes for our young people.
All right, so what I'm going to do now is I'm going to give you some historical context as to how did we end up working towards positive youth development. And really, it all started in the early part of the 20th century when we really discovered that childhood and adolescence were special periods of life where young people learn and develop. Up to that point, honestly, in a lot of ways, we were viewing children, and especially teenagers, as little adults. And so even if you think and go back to looking at things like clothing and even the toys that they played with and stuff, it was all prepping them just to be an adult, but we weren't really kind of thinking about how does that happen, how does that occur. So once we realized that there was this special period that really we could help people develop and grow into the sort of adults we wanted, there started to be an increase in the sense of responsibility towards youth, which then also started having some federal funding initiatives that were addressing a lot of delinquent behaviors that were starting to develop. This then blended into the 1960s where the rates of poverty, divorce, and out-of-wedlock births, not to mention single parenthood, really started to skyrocket. So, kind of thinking about, again, historically, we often look at, things were so different, or, all these girls are getting pregnant out of wedlock, and really a lot of this started to rise in the 50s and the 60s. If you really look at it from a true historical context, it goes way, way back. It's not something that started in maybe the 80s or 90s. The difference is, and some of you may even have known families like this where a young person got pregnant and the young lady was sent away to a boarding school or something like that, so it was hidden. But what happened was we started ending up with so many single parents that the community started realizing that they needed to address stuff. The problem was, though, that the focus was remaining on stopping one problem, and it was often about stopping it after it happened. So then we move into the 80s where we got into the prevention models, and those were really focused on preventing problems. So, a good example being Nancy Reagan's initiative of Just Say No to Drugs. And the programs were focused just on that one single problem, but the issue was that when we were really looking at it, we weren't getting the results that we really wanted. And if you, again, look historically, yes, those initiatives were getting out there, and any of us who grew up and were in elementary school, middle school, high school in the 80s do remember those initiatives of things like Just Say No to Drugs, Wait for Sex, things of that nature, but we actually started ending up with some increases in some situations, and they almost became what we would take in modern standards meme fodder. So certainly there were a lot of jokes about it. Bumper stickers were really more the thing back then, or T-shirts, and it wasn't really addressing all the other factors that were involved. Because yes, you might have a young person that's using drugs, but what else are they doing? Are they self-medicating because maybe there's an undiagnosed mental illness? Maybe there's some trauma, and as we know, trauma-informed care really is something that's kind of grown in the last 10 years, really in the last 5. So we were kind of missing those pieces in the prevention model. So as they started to look and go, okay, this isn't working, we're not getting the downward of crisis that we wanted, there started to be some ideas. Okay, maybe not ideas quite like that. More like this. And really, it was the idea that we wanted to look at a broader picture in regards to youth and consensus to develop successful transitions in adulthood, and that was going to require a lot more than avoiding sex, drugs, and violence, which then now brings us to the 90s. The 90s. It was a brilliant time. But really what happened was during the 90s, there were 2 bodies of work that were now converging. One of them was the idea of positive youth development, and then that prevention science that was going on in the 80s. So in other words, we didn't want to throw it out because there were good pieces to it. It just wasn't quite what we needed. So when you started putting together the idea of positive youth development, prevention science, it came with the thought that instead of us fixing youth, we would instead prepare them for the future. And if we did that, they would have a better chance of meeting the difficult demands of adulthood. So we've now given you some historical context. So of course now you're kind of thinking of, all right, so that's great. So what is positive youth development, positive youth human development? And we tend to use the terms somewhat interchangeably because really what happened was the focus was always on youth, but we as an agency work with families as well. And so we started adding in the human component of it to broaden it outside of just the youth and young adults that we serve because, like Andrew mentioned, he was a supervisor of maternity group home. Well, these are young parents. So also thinking about how are we serving them as a youth, but then also how are we serving them as a parent so that they can raise their children in a positive development model. So you'll see and kind of hear how we'll interchange those terms throughout the presentation a little bit. But keeping in mind that PYD, first and foremost, it really is a mindset. It's not a bunch of like talking points or we're going to check off a box and be like, oh, are you doing these things? It's really about operating as a staff member and thinking about how you are working with young people and their families. It really is about what you do.
Yeah, and to echo what Elizabeth is saying, is that it is a mindset, and it takes time to instill that mindset into our programs. And I just wanted to let people know that even us here at Valley Youth House, we're still not there, right? I think like in terms of being completely PYD, I think we're still working on it. I mean, I think it takes training, having those difficult conversations with staff members, and even now I think we're still, some of our programs are still in those early stages of PYD where we're introducing the concept and then being able to have those discussions and with our staff. And it really is that mindset that takes takes some time for it to transition.
Right. And that's why when we get into this, we're going to go over some definitions. And the reason being is that it can be very high level to the point that folks don't necessarily understand it and understand where it's coming from. And that's where our growth as an agency came from, is that, you know, one of the definitions that we're going to share is from was from our former executive vice president, Bob Robertson. And Bob was, you know, and still to this day in his consulting work, was a huge push for positive youth development. However, it was kind of either you understood where Bob was coming from or you didn't. And what we've been trying to do is figure out how to bridge that gap and help other programs understand how this applies to them. So it's also then recognizing it's a lot of self-awareness as well. So it's really about being your best you and who you are and recognizing that you're not always going to be that person. You know, while we are all professionals, we are also human. And so we have good days, we have bad days. It's not the most complex thing, but you just got to kind of think about stuff. Like if you're going into a situation and you know it's maybe going to be tense, or you're working with a really challenging youth or a really challenging family situation, it's like, are you going to be at your best that day? You know, how well did you sleep the night before? Are you hungry? Are you planning your supervisions with some of your staff at 3 o'clock on a Friday and then realizing that you're not really getting anywhere. And it's really because everyone's mind is thinking of either checking out because they're going to be off for the weekend, or they're so worried about making sure that, like, staffing is straight for the weekend, or that there's potential problems, or did some of the youth, their counties come through with things like home passes. And that's what your focus is, which means then your supervision isn't as effective as it needs to be. So it is kind of all that. It's that mindset. It is that self-awareness. It's all those pieces that are going to allow you to really be a PYD practitioner. So to move into this, what we're going to do is we're going to share with you 3 separate definitions of positive youth development. The first one is from Bob Robertson, who, as I mentioned, was our Executive Vice President for Valley Youth House for 30 years, and even does consulting on positive youth development, human development to this day. And this was a definition that he last redefined in 2006, which really kind of talks about that, operational and integrated mindset that we talked about, that we're creating, positive, competent, and contributing youth. So it's really about how I view the world and the situations about me. And it's making sure that we're promoting opportunities for our youth and our families to learn and grow and expand as human beings. And we'll talk about how do we do that a little bit later on in the presentation. But really it is the goal to help them become a positive and contributing member of society. That's Bob's definition.
A more academic definition for people who like wordage, right? It's a process of human growth through which adolescents move from being taken care of to taking care of themselves and others. An approach where policy, funding, and programming are directed at providing supports to young people as they build their capacities and strengths to meet their personal and social needs, and a set of practices that adults use to provide youth with the types of relationships and experiences needed to fuel healthy development. So this is a definition I really enjoy, because it shows that it's not just programs, it's our entire funding, policy, and programs need to change in order to help build those strong support systems for our young people in order for them to then contribute to society, right? So that way they can become healthy and productive adults, right? So that is something that, in this definition, really emphasizes that funding and policy need to change as well as our programming. And we are seeing that, right? We see that in child welfare. There have been prudent parenting has been, been emphasized in the past 2 years. Even even HUD, right, and the COCs, there's been an emphasis on young people to look that our young homeless youth are different, and then how are we addressing those needs for our young people, and hence why we're having these webinars, right? So I think for us to realize that it's going to take more than just programs, and that we also need to emphasize our policy and law policymakers, our lawmakers, to emphasize that young people services to young people might look a little bit different, and then also how are we funding those services that look different to our young people as well, in order for it all to be aligned with positive youth and human development. So that's just something in this definition takes care of, but it echoes a lot of the same things that the definition, the first definition from Bob Robertson, which is creating that opportunity for our young people so they can learn and learn who they really want to be.
Right. And so the last definition is the basic one, and this is one that I think as supervisors, administrators, if you're really trying to help your staff understand what positive youth and human development is, this is a really good one, which is an approach to working with young people that focuses on their psychological, emotional, and social development rather than their problems or deficits. For those who are not familiar with J.T. Fest, he has been working in the field since the 1960s. He operates an organization out in the Pacific Northwest around the Seattle area, I believe, and he's also known as the godfather of modern street outreach. So if you are working with homeless youth and you want to get deeper understandings of some of the things that homeless deal with, look up JT's work. It's absolutely brilliant. He has an ongoing website that he talks about things, and I mean, I've learned a whole lot. I mean, even things about like how nutrition and hygiene impacts homeless folks in just ways that I had never really thought about. Like I was thinking on very high level, and then he just has this way of breaking it down. JT also published a book a few years ago on positive youth development, and it uses card games to help. So again, it's a really good instructional book that you can utilize if you're trying to teach this ongoing with staff. So it's another tool for you as supervisors and administrators to use this as you're starting to roll forward towards making your agency much more positive human development. Before we get into the basic areas, are there any questions that have come up thus far before we move forward?
Elizabeth, there have been no questions at this point other than where can I download course materials for this session? Debbie, they will get posted. I believe an email was sent out already with a link to the materials. If not, there was a link in WebEx that you can look for, but we will share them afterwards if you cannot find them. That was everything, Elizabeth.
Thank you. All right, great. Thank you. All right, so we're going to talk about positive youth and human development, and we're going to give you two separate versions, basically, of positive youth human development. The first one is the one that Valley Youth House has adopted for many, many years. It was the one that really kind of Bob created specifically for us, and it's a really good one for supervisors to use with their staff to break it down because, you know, it's making sure that the staff are providing safety, control, connectedness, and opportunity. And we're going to break that down as to what that looks like in each area, but it's a really good one for, you know, again, for you to kind of think about in terms of, is this what your staff are providing for the populations that they are serving?
Yeah, and then the other one is what is known as the 5 C's. So like for this one, it's very good to be like, what are the 5 characteristics that a young person or a young family could have in order to be their best selves, right? So I know out at the Child Development Center at Tufts University really emphasize these 5 C's of caring, confidence, connection, character, and then contributing to self as being those 5 characteristics that that do predict like successful outcomes.
All right, so we're going to start off by kind of breaking down those 4 areas of the Valley Youth House definition of positive youth and human development.
Yeah, like Elizabeth said, like this is something that I use with my staff quite frequently, specifically at the maternity group home. And looking at, like, the first thing was always that safety, right? Always being like that emotional, physical safety. Are we providing that in our programs? So that was always something that, like, are our young people safe? And as many of you know, that our young people are coming from homes that are abusive. You know, they've experienced trauma while on the streets. Some of them might have been trafficked. So for us, like, we are that first stage where are we providing that safe environment for them, right? So and safe in all ways. Like, are we being trauma informed? Are we aware of what's going on in this young person's life so we're not re-traumatizing them? Is the physical space safe, right? Like, I think that's something that we're constantly evaluating in a lot of our apartments, right? A lot of our programs do that already, where we're checking to make sure that the apartments are safe. And then as a supervisor, it's not just safety for our clients, right? Like, it's also that safety for our staff in order to have those difficult conversations, in order to bring up some of their concerns and be able to say, like, hey, I need help, or hey, like, there's a lot going on here. These are my concerns, right? So it's safety at all levels, from the client to staff meetings to the physical safety of apartments. So that's one of the first things where, like, I really try to operationalize, like, our staff members. Are we providing this safety for our young person? Because, like, if you look at it from, like, Maslow's hierarchy of needs, without that, like, basic needs of like safety and basic necessities, like it's hard for someone to go up that hierarchy.
Right, and just to echo a little bit of what Andrew just said, especially when you're dealing with the youth, is also recognizing, because of their trauma, that some of the things that we may be doing may make them feel unsafe. There might be things about our physical presence that might make them feel unsafe, and so we have to be aware of that and be willing to have those conversations, you know, and maybe suss that out, because if you're not connecting with a youth, maybe you talk to a team member and say, I don't understand what's going on. I think about a situation we had years ago. We had a therapist who was not connecting with one of the youth and couldn't understand why, so they talked with their team, and somebody who was connected with that youth talked with them, and it turned out it was their cologne, and their cologne reminded them of a former abuser. Well, that made the youth feel unsafe around that particular male. So all he had to do was not wear it anymore, and the two of them were able to have that connection. And this goes kind of across the board. Interestingly enough, like we mentioned earlier that we have prevention services, and we provide counseling therapy, as a matter of fact, in schools for students that have been identified that could use it. And one of our therapists found out recently that she could only wear her hair a certain way in the schools because she decided to wear it differently one day, and 3 of the kids were like, why is your hair different? I don't think I can actually work with you today. And she literally had to get a scrunchie and put up her hair in a way that made them feel comfortable to be able to reach out to them. So, I mean, it can be such small things that really can have an impact on them. The next one is the idea of control. And so in this case, we'll want to make sure that all the people that we are working with have a voice and choices. You know, think about those of you who are parents. Even toddlers can and should be able to make age-appropriate choices like, yes, do you want to wear the red shirt or the blue shirt? I want to wear the blue shirt. Great. They feel like a big kid. They feel empowered. They've made a choice. You know that they're going out in public and they're not going to look embarrassing. But not only that should they be able to feel important, it's a huge part of their development. It gives them a voice and it helps them feel valued, important, and safe. If we're to help develop our youth so they can have strong families, it requires that all members have a voice and a role within the home. You know, things like family meetings are huge. In our independent living programs, we frequently, you know, have meetings with all the youth, and we sometimes call them family meetings. You know, we'll get the youth together and have dinner, and they'll call it themselves family dinner, because it is that connectedness piece. Because then they're supporting each other and learning how to grow and make choices in their life. Because let's face it, our control of our youth is an illusion. As much as we like to think we want to control what's going on with them, it's an illusion on our part, and we will drive ourselves crazy if we think that we can control every single thing we can do with them. It's also keeping in mind that there are some things that impact their control that we also really can't control. Things such as poverty, addiction issues, whether it's their own addiction or addiction that's going on within their families, things like housing and regulations. You know, housing is huge. You know, someone who's on a list to try to get public housing, and they've been on that list now for 2-3 years. I mean, that's a level of powerlessness that I personally can't even imagine, you know, and kind of takes that control from that person, because now they're stuck with whatever situations are being thrown at them.
Yeah, and I just want to add from our experiences with control, this is a great area where we can implement youth action boards, right? I think this is, I'll give you a good example. At our maternity group home, like, we were having really, we had issues with curfews, right? Like we imposed a curfew for our young teens and said, like, you had to be home by like 8 o'clock, right? And this is where we were having such difficulties with it, and we turned around and gave the control back to the Youth Action Board, gave them like, so what do you think the curfew should be, right? And how can we help implement this, right? Our Youth Action Board was like, you know what, 10 o'clock is reasonable for a 17-year-old, and it wasn't perfect, but we did see a decline in curfew violations for that short period of time that it was implemented, right? So it does work, because our young people made the rule on their own, and they were enforcing it. Yeah, it's not perfect. Not everyone was following the curfew rules, but some were, right? And it was coming not from the authority of the supervisor is coming from the Youth Action Board. Your peers mentioned that this would be age appropriate, and this is what we're gonna follow. So again, like that whole thing that the youth really can police themselves and can come up with age-appropriate rules. Sometimes it can be helpful to include that youth action board. Oh. And then the other thing is connectedness, right? Relationships matter, and I think this is where we also call this engagement. How do we engage with a young person, and how do we have them connected not just with our program but to their community and also back to their, if possible, back to families. Knowing that, like, currently in our current society, it's getting more difficult to do things on, be independent on your own, to have that apartment on your own. So how do we then, like, help that young person connect to all these various resources that are out there, but also connect to our program, right? And I think this is also examples, I think Elizabeth talked about this recently, where, like, family, like, dinners, right? Like, I think, like, just sitting down with a young person and having dinner, you might not think that case management, right? But you get so much out of it, right? Like, I think, like, sometimes the most meaningful conversations have happened over just sharing a meal with a young person. Other things have been just those car drives, right? When I'm driving young people to appointments, I'm like, man, I did more in this 30-minute car drive than I did in the past 3 weeks with you, right? So I think, like, sometimes, like, where you find connectedness, it happens anywhere and everywhere. But then how do we promote that, and how do we develop those relationships, right? Some of the things that, like, I encourage my staff to do is, like, connect with a young person. If they like basketball, do a session while playing basketball, right? But then also, like, as we're moving this young person through our program, it's then also realizing that at some point they're going to have to disconnect from us and connect with something else out in the community, if it's not a community resource, or reconnecting back with family. So being able to make sure that that person is connected to something, and I know it's easier said than done, but I think it's just to be aware that we're having those conversations with our young people and with our staff. Like, how are we connecting this person in order to prepare them as they transition?
I think mentorship is a good example of that too, where it's like you can help find outside resources for them. And then the last one is we're looking at the idea of opportunity. It's got to be stuff that matters. It's very easy to be like, well, we do all these activities with our youth. I don't understand why they're not connected, but you can't be doing things just because. That's not PYHD, and it doesn't help them or the families develop or grow. So it's really helping them attend or have a choice. So when I did family work, some of it was having parents attend and having a voice in their child's school meeting. So one of the things that I would do professionally is prepare parents to be able to effectively go into a school meeting and advocate for their youth, advocate for their child. I think it's teaching our youth how to advocate for themselves and giving them that opportunity to do that. I think that, again, that's where those youth advisory boards come in, is that it's giving them that chance to advocate for the things that they want. And I know with our local youth advisory board, they'll flat out tell you, I realize the things that I'm pushing for are not going to help me because I'm going to age out of the system first. But if it helps the next foster kid, then my work is done. And so it's given that opportunity to kind of go away. And we've had a number of our youth graduate the system, and they are now advocates throughout the state doing some really, really great work. And, that's because they were given opportunities, or just giving them the opportunity to see that there is more to the world than just the things that they do. One of the last clinical programs that I did was out at our therapeutic camp, and I would take kids hiking, and most of them had never been on the Appalachian Trail, for example, or had never seen a waterfall. And having those opportunities, they saw that there was more than just their small community, whether that was a city environment or a country environment, and they were like, wow, there's other things, or guess what, I would have never thought I'd ever like anything other than basketball. Now I love hiking. I remember two of my young men, they were 14, and they looked at each other and said, hey, when we graduate from high school, do you want to go and hike the whole AT together? Now, do I think they're probably going to do that? Probably not, but the point is that it was a thought of a possibility, outside of maybe what their worldview was ahead of time. So it's giving folks those opportunities that they wouldn't necessarily have had otherwise.
And then, and just to summarize, like these 4 areas are things that can be used in supervision, right? Like analyzing what is the safety for the client. Are we giving some control back to our young people? Are they having some choice? Right? Are they connected? And then how are we providing these opportunities? So I know here at Valley Youth House, that's something that we do is like those 4 areas are things that we're constantly analyzing in our team meetings and our staff supervision.
Right. So that's the 4 areas for that. So now we're going to talk about the 5 C's. With the 5 C's, some of the images that are going to come up are from another PYD model that has strong Native American roots called the Circle of Courage. And we'll mention that a little bit later when we talk about some other similar models. But I want so that you understood like where some of the Native images were coming from. So the first one of the 5 C's is caring. And so it's reflected in the preeminent value of generosity. The central goal in Native American child rearing was to teach the importance of being generous and unselfish. In the words of a Lakota elder, you should be able to give away your most cherished possession without your heart beating faster. So that in helping others, youth create their own proof of worthiness, and they make positive contributions to another human life. One of the ways that we can teach and encourage generosity is the idea of service learning. And giving folks service learning projects provides them an opportunity to feel that their lives have meaning and a purpose. And it's a chance for them to connect also with their communities and learn to give back to others. So we were talking about, you know, before having that connectedness, well, this is a way to do that is through these service learning opportunities. So it's not just doing a task, but it's about unpacking it and giving them meaning beyond what is traditionally thought of community service. So we wanted to give you some examples of what would be community service versus service learning. So we have this chart here that kind of shows you the difference between who is the primary intended beneficiary based on what it is. So just to give you some examples to kind of fill this in, for instance, a community service project might be students participating in a neighborhood cleanup. The community receives the help from a litter abatement and the beautification efforts. Now, if you want to turn something like that into service learning, those same students would study waste collection and recycling services in their city. They would participate in a series of local cleanup projects as a way of learning about accessibility and use those services in their various neighborhoods. The community still receives the help with the litter abatement and beautification efforts, while the youth are also learning about sustainable waste management. Another example is, which is a common one, is maybe having your clients or youth assist serving at a youth kitchen. So obviously the members of the community that are getting the meals, they are the ones that are the beneficiaries. But if we were going to look at that as service learning, one of the things we would do is we'd spend some time studying things like food scarcity in their community. We'd want them to learn about food deserts and the difficulties in securing healthy food on a limited budget, and also with limited resources like public transportation. You know, farmers markets are great, and there are more farmers markets, especially in major cities that are taking things like SNAP benefits, but then how are they going to get that fresh food home when they maybe have to take 3 buses? It's really hard to carry that. It's a lot easier if you have a car, but a lot of folks don't have it. And then we also are in a lot of communities, especially throughout the state, where even the public transportation isn't good. Even here in the Lehigh Valley, while we have 3 major cities, our public transportation, if you miss a bus, you might be out of luck for the next hour and a half. And so having all those groceries isn't going to be that easy. It's also having the youth understand homelessness itself, what its various causes are, and maybe dispelling some myths about what the homeless population looks like. So it's getting past that image of, oh, they're just a bunch of drunks who didn't do what they needed to. And so that's really what the service learning is kind of really rounding those pieces out. And so that's kind of a good way to help them learn about caring.
Yeah, and another thing, like in the 5 C's, is that confidence. Like, how do we instill those skills within our young people in order to be successful adults? So I think and it's at various levels. Like I think like for confidence, for some of our young people might be those soft skills and how am I dealing with the world, how can I deal with my difficult situations, right? And maybe some of the therapy that might be needed in that area. But also the other one might be also the competencies of life skills, right? Like how do I budget? How do we instill all these skill sets within our young people in order for them, when they leave our program, don't need us anymore. That way they are have all those skills to be independent. And I think that's something that, like, moving away from just like, hey, educating them, but moving towards like this area of mastery where they are learning for themselves, where they are asking for help when they need it, is a vital perspective on how to instill confidence within our young people.
Moving in then to confidence, and kind of looking at, as a society, especially in Western culture, we're very much based on dominance, but if you look at things like tribal traditions, it was meant to respect the right of independence is really what we were looking for, was in contrast to the obedience models of discipline that many of us were kind of honestly raised in. It's teaching that's designed to build respect and teach inner discipline. So from the idea that from the earliest childhood, children are encouraged to make decisions, solve problems, and show personal responsibility. And then our role as the adults was to model, nurture, and teach the values, but also then give feedback. But youth were then given an opportunity to make choices without any sort of coercion. Generationally, if we kind of look at it, we've moved away from certain levels of independence in youth, and what we called in the 60s, 70s, and 80s, many of us were allowed to play independently, and so it was just called going out to play, and you said, hey, Mom and Dad, I'm going to go down the street to Billy's house, is that okay, or I'm going to go on that playground, and your parents were like, that's fine. That's actually now called free-range parenting, whereas we grew up and it was just called parenting. And it wasn't that big of a deal, but, we've all seen newspaper articles where someone has allowed their children to play in their yard unsupervised and had the police called and, actually had to look at it. So, we've all heard of helicopter parents. Well, now there's a new trend called lawnmower parents, and the idea of a lawnmower parent is that they mow down all the obstacles ahead of time so the child doesn't even realize that there were any problems that they might have had to go past ahead of time, which means we're not then teaching them problem solving and we're not teaching them resilience. I think about the program that I worked in last with the young men, and one of the things that we would do is we would teach them how to cook from scratch every Saturday night. 85% of the kids that I worked with had never cooked a meal from scratch before. They had no idea how to read a recipe. They didn't understand the difference between teaspoons, cups, none of that. They were just kind of told, get out of the kitchen, you're not allowed to. But the crazy thing about it is a lot of them very quickly showed great confidence, and they made some absolutely outstanding meals. And I'd ask them when they were picking up on this, I'm like, are you allowed to cook? And literally they'd be like, no, I'm not allowed to cook at home. My mom thinks I'm going to burn the kitchen down. And the funny thing about it is at the end then, at the end of the program, we would actually give chef's coats to the kids that showed the greatest competency. And most of the time, these were kids that had never been allowed to cook before. And the look on their families' faces when they got a chef's coat for being outstanding cook, and you're looking at their parents going, let them cook once a week. It's going to save you some effort. They were just really, really surprised because their child had this competency that they didn't realize was there, but someone just had to give them the confidence to try and to give them a chance. And so it's also, as a supervisor, it's going to be trusting and empowering your staff to make decisions and try things. So, like not being totally sure how something's going to work out, but saying, you know what, try it. And if it works, great. If it's not, that's okay too, but processing that then out with them. It's not the, I told you so on the back end. It's more the, all right, so what did you learn? What can you adjust, and how can we make that better next time?
Then the other C is just connection, and I think I explained that before, but it's that spirit of belonging. So like that mantra that says it takes a village to raise a child, rings true. That how are we having this young person being connected to, or young family connected to a place where they feel they belong, right? I think we know that youth who feel that they have a connection and have those support systems will fare better in life. So that way when something does happen, they have resources, right? So really striving to make those connections for young people within our programs.
The next C, which is the fifth of the 5 Cs, is the idea of character. So it's working towards making a difference in their homes, their work, their school, and the community. And a lot of this is really talking about them having a moral compass, also known as showing integrity. We often talk about, things like professional courage or integrity of doing what is right even when no one is looking. As far as us as staff, that's also us owning up to the mistakes that we have and that we make on a regular basis, and talking with the youth or talking with the family and saying, you know what, I made a mistake, I messed up, or, if I handled something incorrectly, saying that, like, it was my mistake, I'm bad, and I'm sorry. Just I'm apologizing and saying I'm sorry has a huge impact on the populations that we serve in a way that most of them are unfamiliar with because they're not used to people, especially adults, owning up to their mistakes. It's just a matter of, well, it doesn't matter, I'm an adult.
And then the other thing is contribution to self, right? Like, I think that's something that, like, how the 5 Cs manifest in a young person, and how they're giving back to their community, giving back to their family, giving back to their own, to themselves. And it's something that's really striking here at Valley Youth House is that, like, how many of our former participants end up coming back being employees, right? I think that's something that, like, I just hired someone recently that was a former participant, and we have a program, our drop-in center right now. I think 50% of our staffing at our drop-in center are former participants, right? Like, so full-time employment. So it's surprising, like, hey, you actually want to work here? You actually like it here? That's also, like, contributing to self, and that's contributing back to their community as well, right? Like, they're giving back, right? And that's I think, like something that, like, we're seeing that, like, when all of these things are in place and positive youth development is in place, that we're finally seeing our young people give back to not just themselves but their community as a whole.
So before we move on, Brendan, are there any questions that have come up during the definitions?
There have not been any questions at this time.
Okay, great. So what we wanted to look at is that this is not something, again, that just Valley Youth House does. There are other organizations, some national organizations, that also believe in positive youth and human development models. A lot of you are probably familiar with 4-H, which is an agricultural organization that is national, that works with a lot of youth. They have a lot of material, so if you start doing your own research on positive youth development, there are huge packets of information that are going to come through from 4-H. Girls on the Run is a girls basically couch to 5K program that usually elementary school age girls take part in, and they can do it regardless of their ability to pay. So it's run in a lot of different schools locally. We have a huge program, and all of our schools, from our highest socioeconomic elementary schools to our poorest schools, all participate, and they all get to compete in the exact same 5K at the end, and it's a really huge event. They all have running mentors that run alongside with them, but I mean, it's huge, and there's like literally over 1,000 people in a park cheering them all on, having a great time, and they get to really feel special. And, again, it's targeting all female identifying youth, so they all get a chance to take part, because even if their family doesn't have whatever the entry fee is, that's waived, and there's fundraising that's done in order to cover the cost of the coaching oftentimes, which is volunteers. There's an organization called Youth Uprising. They're based out of Oakland, California. The Urbano Project is based out of Boston, Massachusetts. And then there's the Youth Indian Leadership Program, and they are in Gallup, New Mexico. And so those are just some examples that, if you want to see some other organizations, whether they are more local-based or national, that also use these models as well as us. There's also some outcome models that have PYD roots that, again, you can look at if you're looking to do your own work, or maybe figure how are you going to adapt this to your own organization. So there's the 40 developmental assets. It's a really good assessment tool to see where the youth and families that you're working with are at, especially in the beginning, to kind of see like, okay, what are their strengths to begin with, because we're really going to utilize those going forward. The one on the top right-hand side, that is the Circle of Courage that I mentioned earlier. That, as I said before, is a Native American-based version of positive youth development. There's the essential elements, there's targeting life skills, and then there is this curriculum, and it's a curriculum you can purchase called Ready for 21, and it's that idea that all youth are ready for college, work, and life by age 21. And I think for all of us in the work that we're doing, we really, that's the sort of thing that we're going to be encouraging, is how close to the age of 21 or, you know, maybe even 25 can we get them prepared for those things so that they can move forward as adults.
Yeah, so some misunderstandings about PYD, right? I get this a lot, especially for my young, like my new staff. The first one is that we're just letting youth run our programs, right? Hopefully, in what Elizabeth and I were discussing, hopefully that's not how we framed it. But I do get that pushback a lot from staff that, like, we're letting them control our program, and that's not what it is at all, right? Like, we're having them have some voice into it, and like what Elizabeth mentioned in the previous slides, there are limitations, right? Like, we have some of our apartments are licensed, and we have to follow some regulations, and there's certain things they can have and they can't have. But we're having those discussions with our young people, and it's not like Lord of the Flies, right? Like, we're not just having them run everything, et cetera. So that's a big misunderstanding, and we're really focusing on those 4 areas of safety, or that main area of safety, like, and that's always going to be paramount, right? Like, if something's not safe, we're not going to let them do it, right? Like, that's not, and we will prevent that from happening. And then the other thing is that we're assessing that control and connectedness and opportunity, and that's what it's in a constant assessment and constantly having conversations with our young people about those 4 areas, and if it is meeting their needs and the needs of the program.
You know, and just to kind of add on a little bit to what Andrew said, you know, one of the things that you could do with client participation, and something that we do at Valley Youth House, is whenever possible, we have youth sit in on interviews of potential staff. And so we want their input. We want to kind of get their opinion, but ultimately it is our decision as the staff or as supervisor or directors on who we're going to choose, because, you know, the youth may have some really good points, and honestly, we've had some youth in some situations where it was like a less than positive interaction, and they're like, they can't handle us. You don't want to hire them because they're going to freak out too quickly, so don't do that. But also, you know, again, they might decide someone's really, really cool, and maybe some red flags came up for you in the interview, so you're going to overrule that. But the point is, you want their interaction, because you want to know if this person is going to be working with their youth, can they engage with their youth? And we want to make sure that, you know, they're going to be safe, and that folks are going to feel comfortable, and it is going to kind of contribute to all those things.
So, yeah, like, client participation is important because it improves program outcomes, and we want their input and perspective. But it's much more than that, right? Like, I think yes, that's exactly what we want, but and something that's been happening recently, right? Like, a lot of our YABs have changed, right, from youth advisory boards to youth action boards, right? And I think, like, even that name change is encouraging us, like, it's beyond just getting their input and perspective. It's about action and making them involved in the programming and having them be integrated into the everyday decisions of our program, within limits, like Elizabeth said. So there is, like, it's thinking about that bigger picture of how are the youth making a difference, rather than just it being a checkbox on our grants that, all right, yes, we have a youth action board, check. Like, so how is that youth action board really working in the framework of your program? Yeah, so, another pushback we get is client participation means giving all the power and decision to the young people. And No, I mean, I think that's something that we get pushed back a lot, but it's like, I think Elizabeth explained it very clearly before, that it really is like there's still limits and decision still comes back to us, but it's really incorporating, all right, how are we really integrating your input and your perspective into our program.
Right. It's really about making it a partnership between us and the youth, so that we're kind of walking alongside each other, as opposed to it potentially being either it's all guided by us, it's all guided by them, or it's this adversarial thing where we're fighting each other, so that we're sharing the power with them. We're not giving it all to them. One of the other things, and this is probably the area of pushback that, when we talked about it, that we've seen probably the most frequently, especially in some of our programs that have considered themselves to be strength-based for years. And a lot of our programs, I would say all of our programs within Valley Youth House are strength-based, but as we mentioned earlier, we're trying to move everybody towards that PYD model. And so when you mention it, some folks are already like, well, we already are strength-based, kind of assuming that they are one and the same. And strength-based approaches are part of PYHD, but they are not the same. Basically, here's the difference. Strength-based systems start with an identified problem that youth, young person, family has, and then it looks at all of their strengths to help them work towards solving the problem. In the positive youth and human development model, what we're saying is that all people, regardless of anything else, are going to grow and develop one way or another. But if we implement these strategies, we can be a part of them growing and developing in a productive manner. So it's about all people, it's not just about some people. As we mentioned before, part of the change was that things were all about targeted youth. So, positive youth development models are the idea of how can this impact everybody? How can this impact as many youth as possible? How can we do this? And you can even do this on an individual basis. If you're a parent, the way I liken it to of raising your child in a positive youth development model in your own home is this. Your baby is born and you look at them and they are beautiful and they are amazing, and if you were thinking in more of this strictly strength-based model, you would look at this amazing, beautiful child and you'd think to yourself, they're beautiful, how do I keep them from being an axe murderer? How do I keep them from robbing banks? How do I keep them from using drugs? That's all very deficit thinking, and it's worried about all the bad things that they're going to do, and that's not something we traditionally do as parents. We're thinking about, I wonder what kind of amazing person they're going to grow up to be. I hope they're going to be this. I hope that they're going to be just like me. I hope they're going to be into music. I hope they're going to be into art. And that's really the positive youth development model. So it's like if your goal is that you want your child to be exposed to all these things, and that's what you do, is you expose them to as many opportunities as possible. And you can do that even on a limited budget. There are, again, parents that maybe, and families that don't have a lot of money, but they have gotten really good at looking at what are the days of no admission to an art museum. And that's the day that they take their child to get a chance to see art. They will be huge proponents of going to the library on a regular basis and looking up different books. These are the parents that read regularly to their children to expose them to as much literature as possible. So these are all things that you can do that are very PYD, that, again, you're exposing them to that opportunity. And, yes, there are challenges of doing this if you're working with socioeconomic issues, but then that's where we come in as service providers and help them overcome those obstacles, because maybe they didn't realize that there are museums that have free admission, or that it's easy to get a library card. And we want to make sure that we do that and give them those opportunities to be able to do that. So now we're getting into the practical applications part of some of this. So it's like, okay, so now what do we do? As the adult, part of it is, we mentioned before, is that your self-awareness is going to be absolutely critical. Recognize your own role as a facilitator. So we really want to make sure that we understand that we do have power over our clients, and that we're being very cognizant of that power dynamic, so that we're giving them an opportunity to be their best selves and grow and also make mistakes and work through those mistakes, because we don't want to also work with youth where they're afraid to ever make a mistake, because usually what that means is they're never going to try. So we want them to know that that is okay, and we as the adults and as the authority figures are not going to condemn them. You know, certainly we're going to make sure that they are safe, so if they're about to do something that is absolutely unsafe, we may have to then come down a little bit more forcefully and say, no, I'm sorry, I can't allow you to do that. But if there's not going to be any sort of great harm, we're going to let them try it, even if we have a feeling it might not work that way, and then we're going to prepare ourselves for how are we going to process with that so that it then turns into a learning opportunity for them. One of the other things we want to do is we want to make sure that we are not only seeing them, but hearing and acknowledging who they are and what they're saying, and this is extremely undervalued. You know, I've worked with a lot of youth in my career that one of their biggest complaints is that nobody's listening to me. Now, sometimes nobody's listening to me is literally nobody's agreeing with me, and that is a possibility, and we need to, you know, acknowledge that. But sometimes it's also really taking the time to hear what they're saying. When we do ropes course facilitation, we talk about the idea of being here and being present. So are you really, really listening to what is being said? Are you filtering through maybe the emotion and the screaming and potentially the cursing that they are doing? I think that is something that happens a lot too, is that a lot of our youth, their emotional regulation isn't where it needs to be. So they might start yelling or screaming or cursing, and we have to spend the time to really kind of hear through all that, because what you may hear amongst all that cursing and stuff is a lot of pain and anguish and hurt. And what you can do is then you can focus on that instead of focusing on the, you know, I don't want to hear that language in my office, or we don't talk like that. There's a time and a place to address that, but that is not the moment. It's more the, I hear what you're saying, you're telling me this, and you're repeating that and making sure that, that you're there. It's also that self-awareness that some of us maybe make jokes when things are really intense, or when you're really nervous, you may smile or you may laugh, and recognizing that if you do that, that could potentially really derail the interaction that you're having with that youth or with that family, because they're thinking that you're not taking them seriously. Also, being uncomfortable with silence and getting comfortable with being uncomfortable with silence. Sometimes it's going to take them a while to process something, and you might just need to put an idea out there and just sit there and wait for them to come up with whatever response that they're ready with. Because oftentimes, no one's maybe asked them these questions before, because they've come from such dictatorial old school service providers that they're not sure how to make those decisions for themselves in their life. I think about years ago, we had a life skills counselor that was looking at one of his youth and was like, well, what do you like to do? As they were trying to figure out what he wanted his life goals, he's like, I like people telling me what to do, because he had never had an opportunity to make decisions for himself, so he really wasn't sure who he was. You know, and unfortunately at 17, he hadn't really built much of an identity yet. Great young man, but was missing a lot of those skills. So it's giving us those opportunities and really investing in them and allowing them to have that moment to have that power and make those decisions for themselves. We want to also obviously demonstrate respect and trust. We want to think about how are you doing that in your particular setting? You know, how are you showing them that you respect them? How are you showing that you can be trusted? You know, and that can be as simple as things like symbols. Do not, you know, if you're working with LGBT youth, do not be afraid to have some sort of a rainbow sticker or some sort of symbol that lets them know that you have a safe place. All of us, many of us in the agency, we use our pronouns at the signatures of our emails. Not everybody does it, but many of us do. Again, it's a way for people to know that we are sensitive to that and that they can trust us to come out, and we're not going to condemn them. Many of our staff also wear pronoun buttons for the same reason. You know, how is your office space set up? One of the things that we were taught was something called a down on your knees activity, and similar to when you baby-proof a room, looking at your office spaces and the spaces that you're in and kind of saying, are they safe, or are there going to be things that are there that are potentially going to trigger them or put them off guard? we knew of an organization where right on the front door it said, welcome to the name of the organization, a place for, you know, abused and homeless people. And then they were trying to wonder why people didn't want to walk through the front door. Well, they got outed the second they opened that door. So it's really kind of thinking, like, what are the things that you were doing?
Yeah, and something else that, like, I think, like, to make it something that's, like, practical is that even those ongoing recognitions could just be, like, some of those basic cultural things that our youth are neglected, like celebrating a birthday, right? I think that's something that, like, for me, one of the instances in my job where I, like, almost, like, broke down in, like, tears of joy was when I ended up bringing a cupcake to one of my clients. And I was like, happy birthday. And they just, like, broke down and started to cry. And I was like, what's going on here? And then he ended up telling me that his family never celebrated his birthday, right? And that was just, these are these small little things that, like, end up building respect and trust among service providers about, like, just those small, simple recognitions that, like, for us, it's a cultural norm, right? Like, in terms of here in the United States, celebrating birthdays is a cultural norm. And, like, we forget that some of our young people might not even have those opportunities because they've experienced such abuse and neglect in their homes.
Mm-hmm. Or even when you return to group home, when you would take the girls to get Christmas trees.
Oh, yeah, that was always an ordeal. But, yeah, again, like, how do we then, like, be able to have them experience things that they normally wouldn't experience because of their backgrounds?
We also want to make sure that we're viewing all of our the populations that we're serving holistically. And so that kind of goes back to understanding the culture of the family or the youth, and really finding out, like, what is important to them. You know, one of the things that even we did, like, for instance, on our intake form was years ago, was that we added a question about faith because we wanted to find out, did they have a faith practice of any sort, and did they want that to be a part of their treatment? You know, our shelters, when they walk in, have a list of the various places of worship so that if a youth wants to attend some sort of service, they have the ability to do that. If they came in the door and there's a church that is local enough to us, we will make the arrangements to get them there. By the same token, if faith has been something that has been very contentious for them or maybe traumatic, we also want to be cognizant of that and avoid that and not, you know, potentially create more trauma for them. We want to, you know, have them recognize in the moment and think about, like, what is going on for them academically. Is school a strength for them, or is it a struggle? Do they have a learning disability that maybe we need to help advocate for an adjustment to an IEP if they're trying to finish school? Is this a youth who it looks like they're not going to graduate from high school because maybe education was never valued in their family? Is this something that maybe we can motivate them to do? Again, one of our life skills counselors did that last March, where she started working with a youth who wasn't going to graduate. And it didn't really seem like a huge big deal to him, but when she went back and found out what he needs to do to graduate, he was willing to do the work. And the day before graduation, it hit him, and he called her, and it was a really emotional moment for both of them when he was able to say, I'm going to be the first person in my family to graduate from high school. And that was a huge modeling moment also for his two younger brothers who were in the same foster care placement with him. So they got to all share that experience together. What's going on with them, with their bodies? You know, do we want to make sure that they have the nutrition that they need? Maybe there's been some health issues that have been ignored over the years. A lot of our youth also pick up a lot of somatic illnesses, and oftentimes it's because unless they were sick, no one really paid attention to them. But maybe getting that honed in a little bit better so that, you know, they kind of have all the things that they need and in the ways that they need it. So it goes back to, you know, as Andrew mentioned before about the hierarchy of needs. So really kind of looking at all of them as a complete person.
And then something else that, like, I really try to hone in with both my staff and our young people is to give reasons, right? Like, I think that the old adage of "because I said so," right, doesn't really work with our young people. It doesn't even work for our staff, right? So I think a lot of the things are, giving those explanations as to why are we choosing this particular direction, or why is this rule in place, or why is this expectation in place. It's giving those reasonings as to what led to that. And the other thing too is also challenging like ourselves as well. Like, why do we constantly have to do this the same way over and over? Does it make sense, right? I think, like, I'll give you, going back to the curfew thing at a maternity group home, why was curfew at 7 p.m.? And the answer was because that's how we've always done it the past 5 years, right? And was it a safety reason? I guess you could argue that there was a safety reason, but again, like, the explanation really wasn't making a whole lot of sense to the staff or to our young people. So really, really dissecting those decisions and those processes in order to really understand what's really going on. And then sometimes we realize we need to change, right? And that's okay too. And then again, going back to how we started our conversations with that, like, hey, safety, right? Those changes aren't going to occur if safety is not there. Our staff aren't going to bring up those difficult conversations if safety is not there. Our young people aren't going to feel comfortable to talk to the supervisor or to the case manager about concerns that they have because they're not, it's not a safe place because they're afraid of retaliation. And even staff, the same thing. If safety is not there, they're not going to bring up their concerns because they're going to be afraid to retaliation. So I really encourage you, as you move into this PYHD realm, is that safety is paramount, and then being able to then give reasons and having those discussions, not just with staff, but also with our young people as to why certain things are the way they are, and then if we need to make changes, that our programs are adapting and changing as we see the need.
Right, and the idea of giving explanations, for those of you who are wondering about what do you do about that really tough youth who maybe constantly questions why, is that you're giving an explanation in a way that is not dismissive. It is as full and complete as you can. It does not mean that they are going to agree with it or like it, but you're providing an answer. So, if you kind of get that questioning from your staff and what happens if they don't accept it, honestly, what I've always done is, I will explain something fully once. I will even explain it maybe a little bit differently a second time and, check in with them and find out, what about it, are you struggling with? And maybe they have some points, but then it's going to come down to, if it really is about that safety issue, is listen, I've explained this to you. I understand that you do not agree with it, and that is okay. You have a right to disagree. So, again, you're giving them that autonomy to not be told you're wrong, but to be told that we're going to agree to disagree on this. However, as the person who is in charge of your safety, I cannot allow you to do that. So it's kind of really giving that balanced approach of you're going to listen to them, but you're also going to have the opportunity to kind of bow out of the conversation so that you're not, you're not getting sucked into a power struggle, because that's certainly, a huge piece. And when we talk about things like de-escalation skills, that's probably one of the biggest traps that staff run into, is that you get into these power struggles because it's like, why? Because I said so. Why? Because I said so. And it's like, no, I explained it. I understand you don't agree. We're going to move on, but this is kind of the final ruling. So that's kind of where we're going to be at. And then the last piece really comes down to having fun. The populations that we serve, while they have had a tough road, they like to have fun just as much as anybody else. And, you can get so much growth out of things that just seem like fun and activities and really kind of bring some bonding. And so, like, the images that we put up here are images of things that we've done at some of our various events. So the top one, was a staff event where, they all got to do a scavenger hunt together. And it was even things like take a selfie with a brand new employee that's been with us for less than 60 days and just having fun with that. There's a picture of our camp and doing some ropes course. So that's a father and a son that are completing an element together. And this is a family who really struggled with communication. And if you weren't going to communicate, you were going to fall very, very quickly. But, you can see the smile on their faces. They're enjoying their time. And then the last picture is at our LGBT drop-in center, you know, and them doing an activity. Part of what we love about the experiential model and its introduction to it as an agency, which is, you know, a huge part of what we do at Camp Fowler, but we also do it in other places, is it's that idea of learning in therapy by doing. So you're getting your greatest growth by not necessarily being in a traditional talk therapy session, because talk therapy doesn't work for everybody. When folks are coming in with a lot of trauma, that talking can be very painful, and sometimes they can't get there. We utilize art therapy interns for the same reason, and they have been huge in our 2 shelters, and they've identified that our youth are coming in with too much trauma to really be effective with talk therapy, but they're able to get their feelings out through art. So it's really giving that opportunity, that growth, and all these things come out. You know, we talk about giving opportunity to youth. We had a young lady a few years ago got on top of our climbing tower, which is about 35 feet up in the air, and then she froze for a considerable amount of time. And really, the conversation that came out of that was her she was looking at this the same she was looking at her life. She was 21 years old. She was getting ready to age out of care. She wasn't confident in her abilities to handle things as an adult, and her stepping off that platform was, to her, felt the same as her stepping into adulthood. And what was that going to mean, and was she going to be able to trust other people? Because the folks that were controlling her safety down below, and I was one of them, she really didn't know us. She had met us maybe 2 or 3 hours beforehand. So it was the can they handle me? And so she was like, you know, trying to make it concrete as in can they handle my weight? But really it was about, can people handle the weight of the things that I bring to the table? And it was really, really powerful for her to have that conversation and then to take that leap of faith, literally and figuratively, to come off that tower and to see that there were adults that were surrounding her and encouraging her, and her peers as well. Her peers easily could have dismissed her because, I mean, we're talking about a situation that took over an hour and a half and could have been like, I'm tired of this, but they were supportive of her the entire time. And when she touched down on the ground, they couldn't wait to cheer her and celebrate her and really kind of show, like, the growth and everything that they had. And all that came from fun. And so that fun was the therapy. So don't think that just because you're having fun, it's not getting something accomplished. It really is a huge therapeutic part to what you're doing.
And then when you're incorporating all the elements of PYD, it is fun, right? Like, I think that's where, like, when we are creating those safe places, where we are building confidence in our young people, it just creates a fun environment where, like, people are able to just be themselves. And, like, like Liz said, like, having fun is therapeutic, and I think that's something that, like, a lot of our young people have suffered through a lot of things in their life, and then for us to provide that safe environment, that safe place where they can be who they really are, and become that adult that they want to be.
So really that kind of ends the main part of our presentation. So we wanted to open the floor that if there's any questions, we'd like to have an opportunity to answer those for you if you have any right now.
I have one question here for you from Scott. While using these programs, how do we rectify these teachings with the organizations funding us? Often it's all about the numbers with them, and some of these lessons don't immediately translate to hard figures.
All right. Yeah, that's a good question, right? I think, like, we are in an area where we are data-driven, and, like, we have to meet some certain parameters. Like, in our drop-in center, we have metrics that we have to reach of how many youth we're getting in, and et cetera. I think, like, and even for our RHY programs, like, I know that, like, we have a certain number that we have to reach. And I think for us, it really is, like, it's reframing how we are running our programs, right? So you're still achieving, the outcome's still the same, right? It's still getting youth housed. It's still getting youth those basic services. It's still getting youth, like, to transition into their own into their own independent apartment, right? Like, so the outcome isn't different. It's our approach that is different, right? So our team meetings are a little bit different, where we're, instead of focusing on what is the youth's problems, we're honing in on like on those opportunities. How can we help this young person grow? How can we create this safe environment? So I think like yeah, I'm going to push back a little bit. Now, sorry, I'm like thinking out loud, right? Like push back a little bit that like the goals and the metrics aren't changing. It's really our approach of how we are viewing the young person, right? Like, so instead of viewing them as a commodity that, hey, we need to achieve this, we need you to fill a bed, we're really viewing them holistically as a person, as how can they grow in our program? How can our program provide them with the opportunities to be their better selves, and how are our staff being trained, and how are we supervising our staff in order to be able to achieve that, right? And like I said in the beginning, that it is a sea of gray and that it is a huge learning process. I think for us here at Valley Youth House, it's still a struggle, right? Like I'm still, I've been in many staff meetings where everyone's like, I want to kick this kid out right now of our program, right? But it's not about, all right, yes, we have a youth that is presenting some difficulties, but how can our program meet their needs, right? And I will like say that there does come a time where maybe this isn't the appropriate program for that young person, and we have to transition them out to something that will meet their needs. But again, it's a whole different viewpoint of how we view young people.
Right. And just to add with that, I'm thinking about our RH programs, and our initial one in the Poconos and Luzerne County area. One of the things that they first encountered was that they would help the youth get their housing, and then the youth were immediately disengaging and weren't meeting because they're like, hey, thanks for the housing, see ya. And so then they happened to bring in a therapist who was very relational, and her big thing was, I want to, as quickly as possible, upon meeting with them, I want to build this relationship so that they want to meet with me afterwards. And they've ended up having better results out of that because the youth are engaged. They're actually doing some therapeutic work in addition to now being housed. So we've taken care of that goal of making sure that this youth was stably housed, but then they're also doing the background work they need in order to be able to maintain that housing when they graduate out of our program. So it kind of gives them the opportunity for both. So we can honor those metrics and those goals, but then we're also connecting with them in a way that it has a much more lasting impact, because what we don't want is that because we're just honoring the numbers, our youth are finishing our programs and they're still ending up homeless on the back end anyway.
And thank you, Scott. That was a great question.
Yeah. Anything else, Brendan?
That was the only question that was posted to me at this time.
All right. Great.
2 minutes to spare.
So if anybody happens to have any additional questions that you like to ask us later, maybe something hits you in the next day or two or in the future, we do have a couple email addresses that have been listed, and those messages, those questions will be forwarded to us, and we'll be happy to answer those for any of you. You know, we love the idea of organizations wanting to adopt this positive development model, and anything that we can do to help you strive and get there, we are more than happy to jump along with that. So if there's nothing else, thank you all very much for your time today.
Yeah, I just have this is Christy. I have a couple notes to sign off. I just want to thank our presenters, Elizabeth and Andrew, and Brendan, who has been handling the tech and the Q&A questions. So again, if you have questions, feel free to send it. The DMA team will be monitoring these Gmail accounts, the Eastern and Western PACOC accounts, and we'll forward those along. Again, this webinar has been recorded, so if you have colleagues who weren't able to attend, or if you yourself got maybe distracted in the middle and need to go back and re-listen, it will be available. And Brendan will be posting that on the workplace and to the COC's website. Our next webinar topic is the adolescent brain, trauma development and de-escalation skills, and that's going to be on February 27th from 10 to 11:30 again. If you haven't registered yet, please check it out. The registration links will be posting again onto the workplace, but they're already there. There are events on the workplace on the COC pages. And we'll also email out the flyer again. And one final note is that we'll be sending out a quick survey so that we can get your feedback on today's webinar. So we try to keep these really short and to the point. Your feedback is very important to us. It really helps us to shape the webinar series as we move ahead. So please take a few minutes to respond to the survey so that we can keep making improvements. And thanks again for attending. We will be sending out the survey via email with the materials from today, and have a wonderful day.
Thank you, everyone. Thank you, Elizabeth and Andrew. Appreciate you taking the time to present to us.